Chapter 2: A Friendly Conference. It is rare in our present civilization to find a man who lives alone. This remark does not apply to hermits or persons of abnormal or perverted mental tendencies, but to the majority of mankind living and moving actively among their fellows and engaged in the ordinary occupations of humanity. Every man must have at least one confidant, either of his own household or within the circle of his intimate friends. There may possibly be rare exceptions among persons of genius in statecraft, war, or commerce, but it is doubtful, even in such instances, if any keep all their thoughts to themselves, hermetically sealed from their fellows. As a prevailing rule, either a loving wife or very near friends shares the inner thoughts of the most secretive individual, even when secrecy seems an indispensable element to success. The tendency to a free exchange of ideas and experiences is almost universal, instinct prompting this natural man to unburden his most sacred thought when the proper confidant and the proper time comes for the disclosure. For months I have kept to myself the events narrated in the preceding chapter, and this for several reasons. First, the dread of ridicule that would follow the revelation of the fantastic occurrences and the possible suspicion of my sanity that might result from the recital. Second, very grave doubts as to the reality of my experiences, but by degrees self-confidence was restored as I reasoned the matter over and reassured myself by occasional contemplation of the silvery hair I had coiled in my pocketbook, and which at first I had expected would vanish, as did the stranger's knife. There came upon me a feeling that I should see my weird visitor again, and at an early date. I resisted this temptation, for it was a feeling of the idea rather than the thought, but the vague expectation grew upon me in spite of myself, until at great length it became a conviction which no argument or logic could shake. Curiously enough, as the original incident receded into the past, this new idea thrust itself into the foreground, and I began in my own mind to court another interview. At times, sitting alone after night, I felt that I was watched by unseen eyes. These eyes haunted me in my solitude, and I was morally sure of the presence of another than myself in the room. The sensation was at first unpleasant, and I tried to throw it off with partial success, but only for a little while could I banish the intrusive idea, and as the thought took form, and the individual presence became more actual to consciousness, I hoped that the stranger would make good his parting promise. I will see you again. On one thing I was resolved: I would at least be better informed on the subject of hallucinations and aberrations, and not be taken unawares as I had been. To this end I decided to confer with my friend, Professor Chickering, a quiet, thoughtful man of varied accomplishments, and thoroughly read upon a great number of topics, especially in the literature of the marvelous. So to the professor I went, after due appointment, and confided to him full particulars of my adventure. He listened patiently throughout, and when I had finished, assured me in a matter-of-fact way that such hallucinations were by no means rare. His remark was provoking, for I did not expect from the patient interest he had shown while I was telling my story that the whole matter would be dismissed thus summarily. I said with some warmth, but this was not a hallucination. I tried at first to persuade myself that it was illusory, but the more I have thought the experience over, the more real it becomes to me. Perhaps you were dreaming, suggested the professor. No, I answered. I have tried that hypnosis, and it will not do. Many things make that view untenable. Do not be too sure of that, he said. You were, by your own account, in a highly nervous condition and physically tired. It is possible, perhaps probable, that in this state, as you sat in your chair, you dozed off for a short interval, during which the illusion flashed through your mind. How do you explain the fact that incidents occupying a large portion of the night occurred in an interval which you describe as a flash? Easily enough. In dreams, time may not exist. Periods embracing weeks or months may be reduced to an instant. Long journeys, hours of conversation, or a multitude of transactions may be compressed into a term measured by the opening or closing of a door or the striking of a clock. In dreams, ordinary standards of reason find no place, while ideas or events chase through the mind more rapidly than thought. Conceding all this, why did I, considering the unusual character of the incidents, accept them as real, as substantial, as natural, as the most commonplace events? There is nothing extraordinary in that, he replied. In dreams all sorts of absurdities, impossibilities, discordancies, and violations of natural law appear realities without exciting the least surprise or suspicion. Imagination runs riot and is supreme, and reason for the time is dormant. We see ghosts, spirits, the forms of persons dead or living. We suffer pain, pleasure, hunger, and all sensations and emotions without a moment's question of their reality. Do any of the subjects of our dreams or visions leave tangible evidence of their presence? Assuredly not, he answered, with an incredulous, half-impatient gesture. The idea is absurd. Then I was not dreaming, I mused. Without looking at me, the professor went on. These false presentments may have their origin in other ways, as from mental disorders caused by indigestion. Nikolai, a noted bookseller of Berlin, was thus afflicted. His experiences are interesting and possibly suggestive. Let me read some of them to you. The professor thereupon glanced over his bookshelf, selecting a volume, and proceeded to read. I generally saw human forms of both sexes, but they usually seem not to take the smallest notice of each other, moving as in marketplace, where all are eager to press through the crowd. At times, however, they seem to be transacting business with each other. I also saw several times people on horseback, dogs, and birds. All these phantasms appeared to me in their natural size and as distinct as if alive, exhibiting different shades of carnation in the uncovered parts as well as different colors and fashions in their dresses, though the colors seemed somewhat paler than in real nature. None of the figures appeared particularly terrible, comical, or disgusting, most of them being of indifferent shape and some presenting a pleasant aspect. The longer these phantasms continued to visit me, the more frequently did they return, while at the same time they increased in number about 4 weeks after they had first appeared. I also began to hear them talk. These phantoms conversed among themselves, but more frequently addressed their discourses to me. Their speeches were uncommonly short and never of an unpleasant turn. At different times these appeared to me both dear and sensible friends of both sexes, whose addresses tended to appease my grief, which had not yet wholly subsided. The consolatory speeches were in general addressed to me when I was alone. Sometimes, however, I was accosted by these consoling friends while I was engaged in company, and not unfrequently while real persons were speaking to me. These consolatory addresses consisted sometimes of abrupt phrases, and at other times they were regularly executed. Here I interrupted. I note, Professor, that Mr. Nikolai knew these forms to be illusions. Without answering my remark, he continued to read. There is in imagination a potency for exceeding the fabled power of Aladdin's lamp. How often does one sit in a wintry evening musings, and trace in the glowing embers the features of an absent friend? Imagination, with its magic wand, will there build a city with its countless spires, or marshal contending armies, or drive the tempest-shattered ship upon the ocean? The following story related by Scott affords a good illustration of this principle. Not long after the death of an illustrious poet who had filled, while living, a great station in the eyes of the public, a literary friend to whom the deceased had been well known was engaged during the darkening twilight of an autumn evening in perusing one of the publications which professed to detail the habits and opinions of the distinguished individual who was now no more. As the reader had enjoyed the intimacy of the deceased to a considerable degree, he was deeply interested in the publication, which contained some particulars relating to himself and other friends. A visitor was sitting in the apartment, who was also engaged in reading. Their sitting room opened into an entrance hall, rather fantastically fitted up with articles of armor, skins of wild animals, and the like. It was when laying down his book and passing into this hall, through which the moon was beginning to shine, that the individual of whom I speak saw right before him, in a standing posture, the exact representation of his departed friend, whose recollection had been so strongly brought to his imagination. He stopped for a single moment, so as to notice the wonderful accuracy with which fancy had impressed upon the bodily eye the peculiarities of dress and position of the illustrious poet. Sensible, however, of the delusion, he felt no sentiment save that of wonder at the extraordinary accuracy of the resemblance, and stepped onward to the figure, which resolved itself as he approached into the various materials of which it was composed. These were merely a screen occupied by great coats, shawls, plaids, and other such articles as are usually found in a country entrance hall. The spectator returned to the spot from which he had seen the illusion, and endeavored with all his power to recall the image which had been so singularly vivid. But this he was unable to do, and the person who had witnessed the apparition, or, more properly, whose excited state had been the means of raising it, had only to return to the apartment and tell his young friend under what a striking hallucination he had for a moment labored. Here I was constrained to call the professor to a halt. "Your stories are very interesting," I said, "but I fail to perceive any analogy in either the conditions or the incidents to my experience. I was fully awake and conscious at the time, and the man I saw appeared and moved about in the full glare of the glass-light." "Perhaps not," he answered. "I am simply giving you some general illustrations of the subject. But here is a case more to the point." Again he read. Universal. Instinct prompting this natural man to unburden his most sacred thought when the proper confidant and the proper time comes for the disclosure. For months I have kept to myself the events narrated in Chapter 2 of Friendly Conference. It is rare in our present civilization to find a man who lives alone. This remark does not apply to hermits or persons of abnormal or perverted mental tendencies, but there may possibly be rare exceptions among persons of genius in statecraft, war, or commerce, but it is doubtful, even in such instances, if any keep all their thoughts to themselves, hermetically sealed from their fellows. As a prevailing rule, either a loving wife or very near friends shares the inner thoughts of the most secretive individual, even when secrecy seems an indispensable element to success. The tendency to a free exchange of ideas and experiences is almost to the majority of mankind living and moving actively among their fellows and engaged in the ordinary occupations of humanity. Every man must have at least one confidant, either of his own household or within the circle of his intimate friends.